The man, just having woken up, didn't notice that a chilling news report was being broadcast on the TV at that moment. An unknown virus, similar to rabies, was spreading rapidly across the globe. Infected individuals would lose their sanity and become highly aggressive. The report urged the public to take precautionary measures. Unaware of the news, the man went about his day as usual. When he stepped outside, he noticed there were unusually many ambulances on the road. While shopping at the supermarket, he saw that everyone was frantically stockpiling supplies. Although he found this strange, he didn't think too much about it. After buying enough food to last a few days, he returned home. It wasn't until the evening, when his sister sent him a video, that he understood what was really happening. His sister, who worked in a government department, knew more of the inside story. She said the virus was even worse than reported. The authorities had already set up a safety zone on an island, and she urged him to come there and join her for shelter. Realizing the severity of the situation, the man quickly booked a flight to leave. But when he was in line to board, the ticketing system suddenly failed. Then, he saw that all flights had been cancelled. Soon after, everyone's phones received an emergency message. Due to the virus spreading so quickly, the country was under full martial law, with no one allowed to enter or leave. Some people immediately realized something was wrong and began shouting. The man hurriedly called his sister to ask for more details. She told him to return home and wait, assuring him she would send someone to pick him up. However, when he tried to go back, he found that the streets were completely blocked, with no way through. People who had received the same news were now panicking, desperately trying to escape. Seeing the massive crowd forced to gather in one place, the man grew increasingly uneasy. He quickly abandoned his car and, with his luggage in hand, started walking back home. But when he finally made it home, he found that his neighbor's house was surrounded by a large group of soldiers. He then saw his neighbor being tied up and taken away, screaming and writhing uncontrollably. The sight was terrifying. The man felt an even stronger urge to leave. But the next day, his sister brought bad news. The authorities had not only enforced martial law in their area, but they also planned to set up quarantine zones to control the virus. Military forces were about to forcibly evacuate everyone. However, even the places they would be evacuated to would be far more dangerous than the safety zones. She told him to avoid the soldiers' searches and wait until the area was abandoned, at which point she would come to pick him up. The thought of waiting a long time for rescue pushed the man to go to the supermarket to stock up on supplies. But when he got there, the shelves had already been emptied. With no other choice, he picked up some scattered food from the ground. Just as he was packing his bag and preparing to leave, he suddenly saw a police officer running toward him, clutching his bleeding arm. The officer quickly locked the supermarket door in a panic. Before the man could process what was happening, he saw a large crowd screaming as they fled in every direction. Then, another police officer was instantly knocked to the ground by one of the infected. The man quickly grabbed a stick, ready to help, but the next second, he was stunned by the overwhelming force of the infected. Together, he and the other officer managed to subdue the attacker. However, before the man could even begin to feel relief, he saw that the injured officer inside the store quickly began to show symptoms of mutation. Watching his comrade's painful transformation, the other injured officer urgently warned the man to stay away from him. In a moment of despair, the officer pulled out his gun and shot himself. When the man returned home, he immediately nailed all the doors and windows shut. Then, he drew the curtains to block the view from outside. At this point, the military had started evacuating the people, and soon, he could hear knocking sounds at his door. He quickly hid in a corner, making sure not to make a sound. Miraculously, he managed to avoid being found during the soldiers' search. Half a month later, the entire city had turned into a ghost town, completely abandoned. Yet, the man still hadn't received any rescue, and the lack of signal made it impossible to contact his sister. To make matters worse, his food supply was nearly gone. With no other choice, he risked going outside to search for supplies. Armed with only a fishing spear, he didn't dare venture too far. He started rummaging through the nearby neighbor's house. After searching several homes with no luck, he pressed on. But just as he was about to give up, he made an unexpected discovery. There was someone else who, like him, hadn't evacuated.
I've got nothing.
It turned out that the old woman hadn't been able to evacuate because of her leg disability. Her presence only worsened the situation. However, she had been keeping watch by the window every day and knew which houses had stocked up on supplies. With her guidance, the man not only began to find food but also discovered a motorcycle in one of the houses. The added mobility greatly increased his range of movement, and soon he had gathered a large amount of supplies again. The two of them supported each other and managed to survive for a while longer. But as nearby supplies were gradually depleted, they found themselves running low on food once more. Just when the man was starting to worry about what to do next, the old woman called him on the walkie-talkie that night. She had been listening to the radio and heard a broadcast saying that a group of survivors had established a base and gathered people who hadn't been able to evacuate for various reasons. The man was immediately excited, but just as he was about to respond, the walkie-talkie went silent. Realizing something was wrong, he quickly promised that he wouldn't abandon her and would help her escape. The next day, after preparing their things to leave, he discovered that the old woman had taken poison and ended her life. At her age, she didn't want to drag the kind-hearted man into further trouble. Heartbroken, the man set off alone to the coordinates mentioned on the broadcast. However, when he arrived, he found that the area had already been overrun. The roar of infected filled the air as he was immediately surrounded. He had no choice but to dodge and escape the horrifying scene. Luckily, the speed of the motorcycle allowed him to outrun the infected, but before he could even feel relief, a pile of corpses appeared ahead, causing him to crash. Ignoring the pain, he quickly picked up the motorcycle, only to find that it wouldn't start. Seeing the infected closing in, he had no choice but to abandon the bike and run for his life. After a long, desperate sprint, he finally managed to corner the infected at a dock fence, but there were no boats in sight, leaving him trapped with no way out. Luckily, he spotted a small inflatable boat floating on the water nearby. He quickly took control of the boat and escaped. However, not long after, the boat ran out of fuel and began to drift. Just when he didn't know what to do, he saw a cargo ship approaching in the distance. The man immediately started shouting for help. Once again, he was lucky enough to be rescued and brought aboard, but the strange looks and the language barrier made him uneasy. Fortunately, one of the crew members, Jack, knew his language. When the man heard they were planning to dock and search for supplies to repair the ship, he quickly offered to guide them, mentioning that he knew of a safe zone. However, the captain didn't seem particularly interested and showed little reaction. He had already seen many so-called safe zones organized by survivors.
What do you do?
Jack said something to the captain, and only then did the captain turn and walk away. It turned out that Jack had convinced the captain that the man was an engineer. In this apocalyptic world, laws no longer held any weight. Only those who were useful were worth keeping alive, just like Jack, who was a pilot. But Jack could only help him so much. The rest, the man would have to handle on his own. Later that night, the man heard cries for help from outside. It turned out that they had encountered a few more survivors. But the next day, the survivors were nowhere to be found. Sensing something was wrong, the man immediately asked Jack about it. Jack coldly told him to mind his own business. Realizing that the place wasn't as safe as he had thought, the man quickly mentioned that he knew of a hospital with a helicopter, and they could use it to reach the safety zone. Jack hesitated but still refused to act. With no other option, the man decided to leave alone. That night, he quietly sneaked into the crew's resting area, intending to steal the keys to the dinghy and escape. However, he was shocked to find that the survivors they had rescued the previous day were bound there. Quickly, the man rushed over to untie them, but before they could flee, the survivor was shot to death in an instant. The guards and Jack immediately ran down, but in the critical moment, Jack suddenly attacked one of the guards, and after a fierce fight, he killed the man. It turned out that Jack had been persuaded by their conversation earlier that day. Jack quickly led a few survivors onto the dinghy. However, just as they were about to leave, they were spotted. The remaining survivors were instantly gunned down. Seeing this, Jack immediately opened fire to provide cover. In the battle, he was injured in the shoulder, but fortunately, the two of them made it safely to shore. After driving to the hospital, they discovered that there was no helicopter on the landing pad. Just as they were trying to figure out their next move, the man, distracted while driving, collided head-on with an infected person who lunged at him. In no time, the infected's filthy blood splattered on the windshield, blurring their vision. With no choice, he had to slam on the brakes, flinging the infected off the car. He then quickly got out, shot the infected, and swiftly turned to deal with the approaching horde of infected. Though he exhausted all his ammunition, this action allowed them to enter the hospital safely. Jack's injury could not be delayed any longer, so the man rushed to search for surgical tools. However, he suddenly heard movement in the ventilation shaft. He hurried over and listened closely, realizing someone was speaking inside. Unable to find the entrance, he called out, but his call attracted an infected person. And before he could breathe a sigh of relief, a large number of infected began rushing toward him. The man had no choice but to run downstairs in a panic. He rushed back to the operating room and quickly shut the door. But the strange thing was, Jack was nowhere to be found. The next moment, he discovered that there were still survivors hiding in the safe rear building of the hospital. They had performed surgery on Jack, and the man learned that the helicopter was parked in the backyard. However, to reach it, they would have to pass through an area filled with infected. As the man contemplated whether to take the risk, a sudden gunshot from downstairs startled him. It turned out that the group of criminals from the cargo ship had arrived, searching for supplies. In a sudden turn of events, they were forced to fight desperately. At the moment when they were breaking through the corridor, an infected person suddenly jumped out and tackled a nurse. Though the survivors quickly killed the infected, the nurse was bitten. She told the group not to come near and insisted that they take the children and leave safely. Though everyone was heartbroken, they had no choice but to leave her behind as they continued on their journey. Soon, they arrived at an area filled with infected. The group carefully walked one by one. Just as the man was about to guide the last child across, an unexpected event occurred. A scream instantly attracted the attention of all the infected. In a panic, the man could only hide with the child in a nearby cabinet. But even that would not hold for long. Just as he was about to give up, the sound of gunfire was heard, and everything outside gradually became quiet. It turned out that the criminals, who had been searching the area, had unintentionally saved him. Fortunately, they did not discover the group hiding inside. They narrowly escaped this crisis. However, the hardest part was yet to come. The next 100 meters was filled with a large number of infected. At this moment, the man looked at the fences and had an idea. He suggested that they tie all the fences together to form a circle, so they could protect themselves while slowly advancing. But the plan didn't work as expected. The infected saw them and rushed at them frantically. This not only made their progress more difficult, but they also had to prevent the infected from climbing over the fences. The group group had no choice but to keep attacking and pushing forward quickly. Finally, they safely reached the big iron gates. While opening the lock, they also positioned the fences to block the entrance. Once everyone was inside, they quickly closed the gate again. But just as the helicopter started, an infected managed to climb inside. The man had to fight continuously to buy time. At this moment, the criminals arrived, having heard the noise. They quickly used their firepower to clear a path and entered. Then, they shouted at the group to stop and not try to escape. As the chance to survive seemed to slip away, the man took advantage of their momentary distraction and quickly cut the chains to open the gate. A flood of infected rushed in and overwhelmed the criminals. Naturally, the man found himself in danger as the infected surrounded him. With the infected closing in, Jack had no choice but to start the helicopter. Once airborne, he quickly dropped a rope ladder. The man seized the last chance to climb up. After narrowly escaping, the group quickly flew toward the safe zone. Once they left the area, the phone signal gradually returned. The man immediately answered a call from his sister, joyfully sharing that he had escaped and was heading toward the safe zone. But just as he looked up, a military jet flew swiftly overhead. The entire group, realizing what that meant, immediately sank into despair. The situation at the safe zone was not as ideal as they had hoped.